IndyCar on the 16th of January. Now, I'm broadcasting from a slightly different location today for a number of extremely important reasons. One is that the signal I get sometimes from where I usually broadcast can be interrupted by, let's say, outside sources. But here it's nice and quiet. Nobody really knows exactly where I am. So here's IndyCar. Now, in the past couple of issues of this particular program, I've tried to emphasize some more positive stories in the midst of the deluge of absolutely dreadful statistics, polls, and other nonsense which is streaming constantly to us from the mainstream British media. And thanks to, I think we would have to say, the heroic and exhaustive research of one of my viewers, a man called Frank Scott, who has been to the United Kingdom's Office for National Statistics and actually collated dozens of pieces of information on Scotland's revenues and its expenditures and all of the different things which Scotland contributes currently in terms of revenue streams to the United Kingdom, paints a very different picture from the one normally presented by both the Unionists and the mainstream media of Scotland, with its so-called basket case economy and having to be bailed out by the generous pockets of English taxpayers. Now, of course, we all know that this is nonsense, but this is the first time I've seen really exhaustive research by an activist which actually proves the case. Now, what might be of interest to you is the fact that the Scottish Government, on average, at the moment, spends about £50 billion per year just running the country, providing the services and looking after people, and the NHS and the police, the fire service, the ambulance service, the schools, colleges, all the rest of it, all of the basic infrastructure which you and I take for granted, as well as providing some of the benefits and basically just generally running the country in a reasonable manner. Now, that expenditure of 50 billion is what is given to us in the so-called block grant by England, but that is not all of Scotland's revenues. We must remember that approximately 40% of everything that comes out of the Scottish economy in terms of revenue streams is withheld by the United Kingdom to be spent, as they claim, on Scotland's behalf somewhere else in the United Kingdom. However, the actual amount of revenue generated by Scotland, and this is just assuming, incidentally, an 8.2% share of things like oil and gas revenues, which is our per capita population share of these revenues. If it's all added up, everything, including income tax, council tax, every kind of taxation you can think of, in fact, petroleum tax, alcohol taxes, there are hundreds of taxes which are taken every day across Scotland. The actual amount that Scotland earns for the UK economy is in excess of £93 billion per year. Now, if we're only spending 50 billion of that, and that's all we're getting from Westminster, then if we were independent, we would have roughly 44 billion pounds extra to spend every single year after independence. Now, you can imagine what any Scottish government could do with that. You're getting almost twice as much as you actually need to run the bare bones of the Scottish economy and all of its national infrastructure. You could reinvest in the railways. You could re-tarmac every single road in Scotland easily within that kind of budget, possibly just in a few years. The amount of things that could be done with independence is absolutely gigantic. Now, I don't want to completely spoil the publication of Frank's final version of this. Frank is planning to produce a series of information cards to hand out to potential Scottish voters so that they can actually see what is earned by Scotland and what is kept from Scotland by the Westminster Parliament. Because I think it's very important that people know exactly how much Scotland contributes to the United Kingdom economy and how little it gets back in return for all its efforts. And in doing so, Frank is going to try to reduce this down to something a little bit easier to understand, and it will be printed out in cards which can be passed to anybody that you meet. I think it's a great idea, and as I say, spoiler alert, I don't want to make any more predictions or give you any more information about this. All I'll say is that once Frank has this published, and he is currently proofreading it all to make sure all the sums are correct, I think it's going to produce probably the strongest economic argument for independence that anyone has produced so far using the United Kingdom's own figures. These are not just made up out of thin air, and they are nothing to do with the so-called General Expenditure and Revenue Scotland figures, this fictitious set of figures concocted by the United Kingdom to explain why we can't possibly be independent. But this flies in the face of it and guarantees that Scotland's going to have an extraordinarily wealthy future where everybody in the country will benefit, not just yes voters, but the no voters as well. Anyone who lives in Scotland would be benefiting massively from this enormous sum being raised purely by Scottish taxation. Now, as well as that interesting piece of good news, I was witness to, I don't think we'd call it an argument, let's call it a heated discussion between independence activists online recently. And one person had pointed out that the reason why the SNP wins so many seats in UK general elections is because the SNP is the only sort of viable vote or the only viable party to win seats in a Westminster general election, in comparison to the Unionist side, which has 3 parties, which dilutes their votes, obviously, by reducing them and spreading them amongst the 3 pro-union parties. Now, I pointed out just sort of towards the end of this exchange that, of course, Scotland has 3 independence parties as well. So the SNP is obviously by far the biggest. Nobody would deny that. And they have the largest share of the votes and obviously the lion's share of any UK seats. But there is also, of course, ALBA. At the moment, rather an untested party in terms of its ability to gain seats in either Westminster or Holyrood. But as far as I remember, ALBA currently has 2 Westminster seats, which it will have to defend in the next general election. And it will be interesting to see if, first of all, that they can defend those seats, and also if they can add to the tally. And then there's the Green Party. Now, the Green Party at the moment in Scotland is, I think it's fair to say, has fallen out of favour with the Scottish voting electorate, mainly due to this rash of bizarre legislation which appeared to have very little relevance to the vast majority of the population. Now, I'm not going to go into the details about things like the Gender Recognition Reform Act or any of the so-called green policies to do with things like no more oil exploration or whatever else the Green Party has been legislating about. But the Greens are, I suppose, at the moment looking a little bit like a dead duck. However, it does still give us 3 parties, and that increases the vote share of the Scottish electorate who are in favour of independence. Now, we've often talked about the fact that in order to demonstrate the will of the Scottish people is a majority for independence, we need a vote majority, not a seat majority. Now, that's not something which is going to work out in this UK general election for a number of arithmetical reasons. The best the SNP has ever managed in any UK general election was in 2015, after the ridiculous farce of the 2014 referendum left everybody boiling mad and resulted in a rush to the polls, and the SNP got a stonking 47% of the vote, which I think is probably a record for any British party. However, it wasn't more than 50%. And that's because of the fact there's so many other parties to vote for in a general election, and it's not based on vote count, but seat count. However, this is where the however comes in. At a Holyrood general election, despite the fact that there is a heavily skewed voting system which has 2 parts. First of all, the first past the post vote, which is your first vote in a Holyrood election in which the seats are up for grabs. And the SNP traditionally does extremely well in that, although the last time it faced a general election, it wasn't doing so well and had to go into a coalition with the Greens in order to form a government. But, and this is the big but, if all of the Green voters and all of the ALBA voters and all of the SNP voters all voted for the same thing at the same time, that would concentrate all of our might in one area. That would be like having one super party. Now, this is something I know that Alex Salmond and the ALBA party has talked about in the past, the idea of Scotland united. However, in the event of a Holyrood election, that is the time to do it, because that is the time when a vote majority is possible. Not just in the first past the post seat count of the first vote, but also in the second vote, because despite the fact that the arithmetical shenanigans that the United Kingdom has invented, the so-called Dehunt system, which allows the lesser parties, the ones that were less popular and obtained less votes, to gain seats simply through a trick of arithmetic, it wouldn't matter, because as long as the vote count for the pro-independence parties in the second vote was high enough, the tally of the two votes together should be easily more than 51%. And that would mean that more than 51% of the Scottish population had voted for independence. Now you might think, well, that sounds great, but how do you get independence in a parliament which is supposedly unable to do that because of the laws concerning its entire constitutional framework? And I think the answer to that would be at the point of winning that voter majority in such a general election, there are two things that would need to be ensured. The first one is that all three parties of independence were on the same page with the same manifesto pledge, and it would be a single manifesto pledge. If there is a voter majority, the union will be suspended, ended, and the acts of union repealed. Now, this is where the second condition comes in, because under the terms of the Scotland Act of 1998, Holyrood as an institution can't do that. However, if we have a vote majority and we have a seat majority, then we can form a government outside of Holyrood. And that would mean that all the unionist politicians who got their wooden spoon seats would be sitting alone in a chamber in their own contrived Westminster branch parliament in Edinburgh, whereas the actual government of Scotland, which would be the majority of MSPs elected, would be sitting elsewhere and deciding to end the union treaty. And you might think, well, how are they going to do that if they don't have a parliament to sit in? And the obvious answer to that is to go to international arbitration. And that would mean that the three parties together approaching the United Nations, the Council of Europe, the International Court of Human Rights, the International Court of Justice, all of these organisations would need to be approached and forewarned that this would be the intention if a vote count majority was achieved, that that parliament formed from those MSPs who had been elected in that way would sit out with Holyrood and would repeal the Acts of Union with the support of the international community, because self-determination, that is, the right of every nation to decide on its own political future, is an international human right, and it's one that's being denied to the Scots by Westminster. In invoking the United Nations Charter and in gaining a pro-independence majority of over 50% of the voters, it would be, I think, important that the government, which was formed from that majority, would then recall all the pro-independence MPs that it had got at this general election back to Holyrood to bolster that, and also to remove the Scottish contingent from Westminster. And not being represented at Westminster would mean that we were no longer acting as part of the Union. And that would provoke a political crisis. And that crisis could only be resolved by international arbitration. And that is where such arbiters as the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and so on, would become more important to us. But this all depends entirely on using the Holyrood election, making sure that the conditions, the preconditions that we set before that general election are clearly understood, printed in gigantic letters of fire, 20 feet high if necessary, so that every voter in Scotland understood exactly what their vote was going to mean. And that would crystallise it down to just two choices: vote for us and end the union, or vote for them and stay in it. And in that way, it makes it crystal clear to everybody what the Scottish voters' intention is. And it would be a challenge to the United Kingdom's power over us that we could do that, and we could cause that international constitutional crisis for the British state at a time when it obviously doesn't want that to happen. But that, to me, seems like one of the few viable ways of doing this. But it is possible, and we can get a vote majority. We just need to make sure that we are all singing from the same hymn sheet. And if we do that, we will get that voting majority in 2026. And that's not very far away now. A couple of years from now, we could be doing this. Anyway, I thought I'd leave you with that happy note. The fact that you're going to be so much more wealthy as an independent state, and that there are ways in which we can get a vote majority to ensure that it happens. Right at the moment, our political leaders seem to be reluctant to make any such plans. They just will not do it. And I think the reason why is obvious to all of us, that because to do that, they would have to break their oath to the United Kingdom's Crown and to the United Kingdom's Parliament, which is sovereign over them. And having sworn an oath to uphold all of that, they're basically having to play by the United Kingdom's rules, so they can't really act that way. And that means we need to put the pressure on them over the next couple of years to make sure that we get this vote, and we get that vote majority in 2026. I'll leave you with those interesting thoughts. That's it from IndyCar today. Join me again later in the week. In the meantime, keep the faith. Bye for now.